Wow, thank you. We're all a little emotional. Didn't that make you kind of choke up, that video? It was so good. It was brand new. And I think it really captures a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So let me just bring these people up. Christopher Hawthorne, Chief Design Officer for the City of Los Angeles, who works in the mayor's office. Wherever you want, I don't know. Selita Reynolds, General Manager for LADOT, the Department of Transportation. And PhillipA.Washington, who made that beautiful video himself as the CEO of Metro. All right, welcome, right? That was a really amazing video, I have to say. I mean, can you tell us just to start how that came about, that new campaign? Because I'm super curious.
Well, first of all, join the movement. How about that?
Yes.
Join the movement.
Oh, and they're going to make you take a different mic, maybe, or...
Yeah, first of all, join the movement. It's so great to be here. We started that campaign probably about 2 or 3 months ago. We started thinking about how we would put something out that was really, really aggressive, really, really active. And we first showed this, I think, on election night, the midterm elections, November the 6th, and it was a big hit. We're going to be playing it for Monday Night Football on next Monday when the Rams beat the Kansas City Chiefs. So it's a join the movement action.
I like it. That's great. I mean, I think this is the kind of bold action and I don't know, change making that we are going to talk about on this panel. And I first wanted to start. I love that. I'm sad that Chris works in the mayor's office in some ways because he doesn't get to write beautiful stories. I mean, you can maybe for yourself. You just write them at home and like.
I do.
You just write them.
I write in my
He used to be
diary.
the architecture critic for the LA Times, so he has this vast knowledge about our transportation history. So I kind of asked for a little provocative image or thought from him, and we have an image that he is going to share and tell you about, just to give you some insight of how LA has always been thinking about transportation.
Thank you, Alyssa. It's really, I want to echo what Phil said. It's really great to be here. Quick show of hands. It's a little, I can't quite see the audience, but how many of you have seen this image before? Anybody? So this is an image of one of the case study houses. This is the so-called Greenbelt House by an architect named Ralph Rapson from 1945. So one of the earliest case study house prototypes that were, of course, commissioned by John Intenza, the editor of Arts and Architecture magazine. And I wanted to show this for a couple of reasons. One, because Alyssa was interested in having this conversation tied together transportation, mobility, and housing. So I thought this is an image that certainly did that. But also is an image that produced one of the, for my money, one of the great lines in architectural criticism history in LA. Esther McCoy, who really invented architecture criticism in Los Angeles, who wrote quite frequently for Arts and Architecture and other magazines, wrote a few years after this image was first published. Rapson's rendering of the house showed a helicopter hovering over the roof as if the owner was coming home to the suburbs from his day at the office. His wife is waving to him. Where is she? Hanging out diapers in the drying yard. In other words, well, she says Rapson's money was on the wrong machine. So, in other words, we have long been a center of innovation, a kind of a test bed, a proving ground, forcing ground for new innovations in transportation and mobility and technology. But there has always been this kind of layering of new and old technology, and also we're going to continue to put our money on the wrong machine sometimes, and we have to be ready for that. And also we have to be ready for a kind of image and a kind of reality when it comes to the intersection of architecture and mobility and transportation of this kind of anachronistic, right, imagery where we have the future and the past and the present layered together. We tend to think of new transportation technologies as replacing and redefining the city over and over again, but in fact the reality is much more often that they're layered and in this kind of tension.
Yeah, and this idea that you can kind of experience all these different layers in one day as you move around the city, right? So used to have the largest interurban railroad. We're building it again. We invented the freeway for better or for worse, and that might, we might need to make some changes to that. The aerospace industry kind of is based here, and that might lead to something like that. We also invented the criminalization of jaywalking, as Salita always talks about. So there are some problems with this layering of history and the way we can jump ahead of them using technology. And what I wanted to do as this conversation to look forward is to look at some of the goals that have been stated by the city and the county themselves and talk about how transportation can solve some of those problems for the future, but in a way, our future really just has to be like next week, because a lot of these problems are becoming very catastrophic, as we can see from our daily lives and our interactions with climate change and housing and all these other issues. So let's start with the easy one, the housing, right?
Easy one?
That was a joke.
What are you talking about?
That was a joke. But there has been, we obviously know the magnitude of the homelessness crisis that the city is facing, and there has been kind of this mandate to add 1 million units of housing over the next 3 decades across LA County. Obviously, we want those units to be near transit. How do we do that? That's an easy one, I told you.
Is that an easy one? Okay, cool. Phil, you not chiming in on that? Okay. Well, there's a couple of things to keep in mind, and I think one of the only countries in the world that's really been able to capture the value that gets unlocked when a new transit line comes through is probably Japan, right? And that they are able to deliver an exceptional public transit system because of the specific way that they've captured that value. We don't do a good job of that in the United States, and instead, as a result, transit is absolutely not the cause of displacement. But because we have failed to build adequate housing, it's a really strong predictor of where that displacement will occur. And it's because about 10 years ago or so, we really started to double down on this idea of transit-oriented development. And we created these really meaningful but also very precious kinds of neighborhoods around transit that became so desirable that they actually became very expensive and remain really expensive. So the challenge is not just how do we unlock and incite massive orders of magnitude increases in housing overall, but how do we make sure that that value is captured and reinvested back into the community, and that the communities through which transit passes can benefit from that. And I would point to sort of 2 things that are really important that Los Angeles is doing. One is there was this little Easter egg hidden in, I think it was Measure J, that passed about a year or so ago, that allowed the director of city planning for the city of LA to set new sort of zoning requirements and affordable housing incentives around high transit areas on his own, without having to go through, without having to politicize that, without having that go through a political process. And Vince Bertoni, who's the director of planning for Los Angeles, has really took that challenge, wrote those guidelines, streamlined that housing, and has seen a huge uptick in the amount of affordable housing and let's call it delightful density around transit. I think density gets demonized, and I want to take it back around transit corridors. And so the second thing I'll let Phil talk a little bit about, because I think under Phil's leadership, Metro has done some incredible work to both reframe TOD as TOC, as being about transit-oriented communities, and also raising the umbrella for the kinds of things that transportation dollars can fund.
Yeah, well, first of all, again, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, and the work that CoMotion is doing is fantastic. As Salita said, I sort of think about transit-oriented development in a whole new way. And it is transit-oriented communities. It is the holistic look at a community from making sure that there's good grocery stores in the community, making sure there's good transit in the community, and making sure there's density and affordable housing. All of those things, in my mind, make up a transit-oriented community. And so what we've done, we've said, listen, we are going to make sure that we can look at not just our property around or a station, but how can we partner with the county, with the city, for maybe adjacent property that they own near our station, and look at this holistically in terms of development. And so that is what we've done. We have worked with developers to implement and build about 2,000 residential units already in and around our stations. We're pushing this transit-oriented community concept all through the county. I remember when I first got in this business, and one of my mentors said, hey, Phil, this whole thing about TOD and all of that, transit, you are just the T in TOD. And you shouldn't worry about the other stuff. Just worry about that T, which is transit. And I've always disagreed with that, because when you talk about affordable housing, attainable housing, all of those things, it impacts my bottom line at the end of the day if people cannot afford to live by transit. Because the further and further they move out because of affordability from the urban core, I have to put transit out there. So it impacts my bottom line. So it is in our best interest, if you're the transportation authority, to do what we can. We don't control everything, we know that, but we can step into these leadership voids. We can instigate, we can influence, we can impact how housing is perceived and looked at in our various communities.
I just want to point to one last thing, which is there, and I'm not going to say anything more than this, that the more local control that there is over zoning decisions, the less affordable the neighborhood. And that's a fact. That's a fact.
Tweet
That's
that.
That's not, I didn't make that up. That's not a political position. That's research. And research that I stumbled across when I was reading Ethan Elkind's amazing blog, which is really good resource for all of this kind of stuff. We got to tackle that problem.
Yep.
And I'm not sure how we tackle it or exactly what the right solution is. That's a policymaker question. But we need to be calling that question. And here I'm resident of LA hat on, resident of the world hat on, that we need to call that question. How are we going to fix that? Because if we don't fix that, if we don't put our finger on the scale and bring that back into balance, there's a hard ceiling on what we're going to be able to accomplish.
I think the other thing that's going on here is that we have a real consensus now about transit investment and transit policy across the region, and we really lack that consensus when it comes to housing policy. So there's still a really fractured conversation going on about housing. Look at the way that SB 27, Scott Wiener's bill was received last year. It'll be interesting to see how the new version, when it comes out, presumably next year, will be received. And I think there is beginning to be more of an agreement that we have to think about land use and transportation as closely tied, and that LA, like any other city, is not going to get the transit ridership that we want and need without a change in how we treat that kind of housing policy. But the consistent message we've gotten from voters, Measure M most recently, that kind of supermajority that's required, and really clear and resounding message from voters. We haven't seen that kind of clarity on housing policy for a whole bunch of reasons, which would take a much longer conversation to get into, but it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds next year in particular.
Yeah, the Times. Did you see that Times article that was about? There was a poll for what people thought the solutions were.
Oh yeah.
To I can't remember if it was homelessness or affordability.
It was just like, why is housing not affordable in the state of California?
And build more housing was
on the lowest.
The lowest. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, people don't understand. They just think. I mean, but right, it makes sense that it's confusing to people because of all the different things people are confronted with. So you brought up SB 827. You guys all know what that is, right? It was a bill that was introduced in the California State Legislature. It was defeated even before it made it out of committee because people were worried about displacement. Other people were worried about a 5-story building on the end of their block, that it would like ruin, bring about the end of the world. So we do have an issue when it comes to density and people needing to rethink their neighborhoods. But SB 827 was introduced to help California achieve its climate goals, which are very progressive. We now have a Democratic supermajority, speaking of supermajorities, in our legislature, as well as many seats that are flipping almost daily in the national legislature. So we have a very, very progressive and environmentally minded representatives in our state right now. So let's talk about the climate goals that have been introduced, over the last few weeks, and at the climate summit that was held in September. We're supposed to be carbon neutral, not too far away from now. The zero emission transportation system that we are building now has to be, one step bigger than we were thinking about. So when it comes to that climate goal, and there's many different ways we can measure it. We can talk about how everybody needs to measure it. How are we going to eliminate the emissions? Let's just say the Olympics. Let's just say we're all done by the Olympics, okay? So that's 10 years, zero emissions. Let's do it. How are we going to do it?
Well, I'll start off with that. We've been very, very aggressive at LA Metro in looking at ways that we can electrify our entire fleet. We have clean natural gas now, or CNG vehicles, for our entire fleet of over 2,000 buses. We have set a goal, and our board has approved this, to fully electrify our fleet by 2030. The statute says, 2040? We are at 2030. Now, we're under no illusion that this is going to be, easy, or this is not going to come without a lot of challenges. When you talk about the infrastructure that has to be put in place in our divisions, when you talk about training of hundreds of people in terms of electrification. But we've set that goal. We're going to start off with a bus rapid transit line here in Los Angeles called the Orange Line that we will pilot first with an all-electric fleet for that particular bus rapid transit line. So we're excited about it. We're very, very excited about it. We are scheduling our bus purchases for the next 10 years to wean ourselves off of CNG buses. And we will look to make that goal.
That's great. So, and I think there's a sort of a hidden reason why, even though it's incredibly challenging, we can't go. So, LADOT Transit has an electric. We have 4 EV buses in our fleet now. We have a similar goal to get to full EV procurement, because the money that Phil and I use to buy those buses comes from a lot of times the federal government. And the money has a lot of rules, and some of those rules are that you have to use that bus for a certain period of time. So even if we want to just turn the fleet over tomorrow, we actually can't do it. There's a huge hurdle to that. And I think that's one of those kind of upstream conversations to have about, the tail that's wagging the dog here are a lot of color of money stuff. But the second thing I'll say is we know that to meet our emissions goals, we need fuel efficiency, no question. We need changes in land use, no question. But none of that's going to be enough. People have to drive less. People have to drive less. People have to drive less. You got to join the movement. That's right. And that means EVs everywhere, yes, but that's not going to be enough. And it's frustrating to me when I hear, in the sort of environmental movement, there's a real you talked about fragmentation. There's a total silo of people talking about new mobility and people talking about walking and biking and people talking about transit, and then the EV crowd. And right now they're totally separate, and they don't seem to really understand what a powerful alliance they could have.
I think also a little historical perspective is useful here. I think there is a sense, an assumption even among some Angelenos that this is a city of single-family houses, a city where people need and expect that kind of elbow room, which of course exacerbates all the problems that we're talking about. But the history of Los Angeles architecture is a history of really fascinating experiments in multifamily housing. If you go back to look at the early work of architects like Irving Gill, for example, it was doing modernist, really experimental, innovative multifamily projects that were really about living more closely together than we did maybe after the case study program changed things in the post-war decades. So it's not as though the city has to invent that sort of notion from scratch. We really have in our civic DNA a kind of architectural idea that is before the single-family house, just like the streetcar suggests that we have an idea about mobility that predates the freeway. And the car. So it's not as though sometimes people, particularly outside of Los Angeles, tend to assume that the city sort of sprung up around the freeway, around the private car, around the single-family house and the lawn and the pool and all of that.
I know, I still haven't gotten mine, I feel like, as a, But Salita brought something up that was my next question, kind of, the driving less idea, which has historically maybe been a tough sell for reasons that you cite to the Angelenos. But I just want to throw this stat out there. 47% of all trips are 5 miles or less. Yes. So that's a very bikeable distance. I think even up to like a third of trips are maybe 3 miles or less, which means you could, walk probably a good number of those trips as well. So not walking 3 miles, but if you had a scooter, right, where you needed it, I would walk 3 miles. Not everyone would. But let's talk about the idea of getting people to drive less, since we know that is a goal. And as part of that, maybe capturing those small trips to get people out of their cars. Who wants to go?
Yeah, well, let me start off with that because we're looking at just that. I mean, those short trips between 2 and 5 miles or so, 1 and 5 miles, that is the niche that we're trying to get. But we have to speed up our system in order to get those folks and capture those trips. So speed on our bus system is very, very important to us. We're doing something that we call a next-gen study that looks at all of our bus service on the street right now, our current bus service. And this next-gen bus study, we hope will revamp all the service we have out there. Now, this is a complete look. Most transit agencies, they tweak their service 2 or 3 times a year. But what we're talking about is wiping the slate clean altogether. Now, this has not been done at LA Metro for probably about 25 years or so. And so we're in the midst of that right now. It's about a 15-month effort that we're in. We're right in the middle of it. And specifically capturing those short trips, speeding up the system. We think we can capture more of a mode share, if you will, transit mode share with this system. And the last thing I'll say about driving, we have to make it more difficult for people to drive. Now, when I say that, people, well, what the hell, Phil? And that is...
I like it when Phil says it first.
Tweet that.
Yeah, that is parking. We need to be looking at congestion pricing. Absolutely. We included congestion pricing in our strategic plan that our board approved this last June. And so I'm bringing that forward. Now the thing is, we have to provide options, maybe parallel options, in our system, so people have an option if we implement congestion pricing. But that may be the very last thing I do in Los Angeles.
That's a good legacy, though. You got to go out on that one if you have to. It's
but
fine.
we have to do that. I think that is that's the biggest thing that we can do to reduce congestion in the city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles.
Amazing.
I think there's an infrastructure design question in there, too. I say yes, amen to everything Phil just said. And there's a design question in there, right? And that's really where we need better champions and messengers to talk about trade-offs required to give people those better options. Phil cannot speed up his system without dedicated lanes for his buses, right? And I'm not going to take my 7-year-old on a bike if there isn't a protected bike lane for her to ride in my neighborhood, or even a nice quiet network of neighborhood streets for her to ride in. And then, you know, there's this kind of, we have to be really thoughtful about not being either ageist or ableist, right? We need, people need to move by car still, and there are reasons for that, good reasons for that, but we need to figure out how we make the cost of those choices visible to people, and how we make sure their choices have consequences so they can weigh them appropriately. Because right now, the choices don't have consequences. If you want to drive, it feels free. You have a sunk cost sitting in your driveway or in your garage or on the street that's just right there, and it's a mobile locker, and it's all kinds of other things besides just being a car, and it feels free to just get in and drive it. And it's not free. It has tangible and intangible costs in climate, in safety, in time, in hard costs of infrastructure. So, you know, we know that you can get about 8% mode change by giving people options, but you don't get to 30% unless you have consequences. So pricing isn't the thing you lead with, but nothing else we invest in will ever reach its full potential without it.
That's right. That's right.
I'm really glad Salita used the word trade-offs, because really that's not a word that we've been willing to use historically. When we talk about the design of the city, we have really trained drivers to expect that continually we will remake the city to make their trip across it from one side to the other as efficient as possible, and we will really, every decade or so completely remake the spaces of the city. And the fact is we don't have the luxury of doing that, if we ever did, certainly not now facing the specter of climate change. So we really have to change the narrative about what's required and say that there will be a price to pay sometimes for making these changes, given the importance of what we're trying to do.
I mean, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, just wanted to add one more point, because Salita brought up, this is a tough thing, right? The car. I mean, we're the glamorization of driving. I mean, you got beautiful people, the hair is flowing, Matthew McConaughey, and
Those
so,
Lincoln commercials are
Yeah,
I mean, we're
He's on a
dealing,
ferry
Doesn't
for
really
some
fit his
reason,
brand. I don't
taking
know
his
why he
car
would do
on a boat.
so weird.
we're dealing with an incredible marketing piece that goes with the car. So the question is, how do we capture the hearts and minds of people when it comes to an alternative mode of transportation? And that was some of the thought in this video, in this movement video that we did. This is not going to be easy, but I'm encouraged by the young people who say, let's do scooters, let's do bikes. We got to get rid of these old folks, right, that still
don't
want to
tweet
drive
that.
a car.
Yes, clap for that for sure. I mean, that reminds me of where, Salita just oversaw this developers conference yesterday, or 2 days ago, that LADOT held, where people could come from all over the country and learn about, the tools that LADOT is building and the city is building to help this, these new micro-mobility solutions filter out through the city. And I was encouraged the week before when I was at an event. I just follow Salita around and just go to everything that she does.
Nope, I follow you around.
Oh, thank you. But there was another event where it was Ford had announced that it had bought Spin, a scooter company, and they're going to hopefully be submitting a permit to come and work in the city of LA. But we do have automakers now that are changing the narrative, and some of them are here, and we'll probably talk to you about that. But how are we making sure we work with those companies to help them help us, I guess, is the right question.
Yeah, and I think it's clear that we're not going to be able to regulate our way to our goals, and people are not going to choose sustainable modes because they want to save the planet. They're only going to choose those modes because they're faster, cheaper, or more delightful.
Yeah,
right?
delightful
More
is
fun,
a good word.
More fun. And so in order to think about that, carefully and about how do we put the city in the correct lane, correct seat. We also have to think about how do we solve some of the challenges that incumbents are facing. They're facing the same kind of challenges from digital transformation that government is. And a company like UPS has a electric delivery truck, I think, out front here. And they're doing really interesting work and thinking about sustainability. But they're also paying millions of dollars in parking tickets on an annual basis. And they would really like to not do that, right?
Shouldn't those vehicles be towed at a certain point, Salita?
I have no position on that question.
But smaller vehicles and, yeah, the nimbleness of it. Yeah.
So how can the city sort of make a proposition to delivery companies? Because really, the real secret of solving congestion for the 84 games was that we had off-hours deliveries. That was, all the TDM stuff was great, the transit stuff was great, but it was freight that made the difference.
Yes, that's right.
So, how can we rethink the way that UPS does deliveries in the city and the way that we deliver infrastructure? So if there's a street in downtown, maybe in the morning when deliveries need to happen, we just wipe private parking off of that street. We also direct Uber and Lyft to pick up and drop off on side streets, and we open that curb up for exclusive sort of deliveries, and we open that street up for exclusively transit, biking, and walking. In order to get to that future, I need all those tools we just talked about. I need, great choices, great infrastructure, but I also need the ability to dynamically, elegantly, and cost-effectively use price. The way I price the curb on a minute-by-minute basis instead of an hour-by-hour basis. The way I charge Uber and Lyft if their drivers don't pick up and drop off on side streets. There's value for all of those companies if I operate the street more efficiently. And I think that watching, the auto manufacturers go through what I think is a very visible culture war, where Ford also just announced a few months ago that they were going to stop making all of the middle part of their product line. They're not going to make sedans anymore. They're just going to make SUVs and trucks. And they're also buying an electric bike company. And they're also, my favorite version of the car commercial is when they're all like out on a glacier, like camping in their car. And using nature to sell something that destroys it. Anyway, the thing about it is they're going through a tremendous challenging moment as well. And so how can I figure out, what the opportunity is to nudge them in the direction that actually move us towards our shared goals? Because I believe they're shared goals.
That's great. Anything else about public-private partnerships? I think we kind of went into that zone. So there's a lot of interesting innovations being proposed by the private sector that we hadn't really anticipated. A lot of them are tunnels. Some other things, though, too. We have gondolas being proposed, things like that. You guys want to talk about working with the private sector?
Yeah, I'll start off with that. But let me just go back to an observation, and Salita sort of made me think about this. Transit measures, when we went to the voters in 2016, 70% of the transit measures around the country were successful in 2016. In 2017, again, 70% were successful. And actually, this year, over 80% of the transit measures were successful at the ballot. So, this is incredible, right? People are saying, we want those alternative modes of transportation. They're saying, now they could be saying it for various reasons. They could be voting for transit to get cars off the road so they have more room. I don't know. But
that's fine, right?
But
people really do think that's how transit works.
That's a good reason.
Yes.
They absolutely do.
Yes.
And you'd think they'd want bike lanes under that.
Yeah. But it's really incredible that the public at large around the country, not just here in LA, we passed Measure M with 71% of the vote. That's pretty incredible. But that's an observation. So we have this opportunity, if we get it right, we being public servants elected officials, if we get it right, the public has already said we want it. But that's just a stream of thought. Okay, P3s. I think that we must allow for a vehicle for the private sector to help us build infrastructure. We have become, as government entities, so prescriptive in our specifications, whether it's in an RFP or whatever, that the private sector, we oftentimes have not allowed the private sector to be innovative in such a way to help us. And so what we've said, with the creation even of our Office of Extraordinary Innovation, we have tasked them to go out and pursue ideas all over the world around transportation infrastructure and bring them to what I deem the center of transportation excellence here in Los Angeles County. And so I think as we look to do more public-private partnerships, which we are definitely looking to do, we have said that we want your alternative technical concepts. We want your ideas through unsolicited proposals. We have accepted them. We've received over 100 unsolicited proposals for all kinds of stuff.
Not all from Elon Musk, right? All different people.
Not all from Mr. Musk, but we are working with him on his tunnels. And you mentioned the aerial tram. We have that as well. We must remain open to these innovative ideas, and we plan to continue to do that.
Go ahead.
I just want to say quickly, because of the shape and scale of Los Angeles and the basin, we're going to need a combination of, even as we build fixed rail, even as revolutionary as I think as the Wilshire subway will be when it opens, we're going to need a range of private solutions to help fill those gaps on the other end. And also, we have a long history in this city of those private partnerships. The streetcar system was privately developed by rail barons, and in fact, the one part of LA's history where we left mobility infrastructure entirely to the public realm. You know, we got the freeway network and we got the channelized LA River, right? So there was a notion of in that era of infrastructure that only did one thing and one thing only, a kind of monoculture. So the river was designed just to get stormwater out to sea as quickly as possible. The freeway, of course, only had one goal, which is to move.
Kind of like a car sewer in
and
the,
now
yeah.
the challenge to exactly, and
Flushing the cars towards the, yeah.
just like the stormwater.
Just like
So
the stormwater
to
system.
Salita's point, we have had a very rigid definition of what the street is for too. Because of the privileges that we've given to the private car, we have defined the street for many decades as just really having one purpose, and we have to begin to think about asking the street to do more, as we're asking, the LA River to do more things than just take storm. It still has a flood control role to play, but we're also asking it to be a public space, to be connected to our goals about public health and climate and all the rest. And so that's really the challenge, is to ask these huge regional pieces of infrastructure to begin to do different things and begin to be flexible enough to have some local and neighborhood scale, right? And not just sort of operate at the regional.
And we've talked before just about, oh, go ahead.
I just want to say one thing which is kind of swirling underneath what we've been talking about, but I just want to raise it to the surface, which is the tremendous need we have to address racial and socioeconomic inequities. And when we're talking about pricing, or we're talking about, the freeways, which is, if you want to see systemic racism laid bare, look at the freeway systems in the United States, right? And look at the communities that got chosen as winners and losers in that tremendous public works project, which, while it is a feat of engineering and public investment, its legacy is extremely problematic for a lot of Angelenos who cannot access opportunity and are dealing with the effects of living near a freeway in visceral ways, right? So as we consider, public-private partnerships, I think it's important for us to be pretty intentional and overt about, yes, doing these big muscular things that we love to do in Los Angeles, like build a tunnel through a mountain. What, isn't that the Sepulveda? It's like, let's tunnel through the mines of Moria. The Lord of the Rings reference for all mine. I'm a real nerds. I heard Eugene Holm. I see you. We also have to think about how can we use public dollars as activist investors to try and remedy and make right some of those legacies. So. Public-private partnership that we did recently in LA was with a French company called Blue Systems, a subsidiary of Bolloré. They deliver Autolib in Paris, which is the EV car sharing program. To deliver an EV car sharing program, but specifically to do it with intention in a low-income community around Westlake, the Westlake neighborhood, and to bring in community partners to sit on a steering committee to actually write the request for proposals that invited that public-private partnership, and then to remain ambassadors for the program to make sure that it solves real problems, right? We also just can't drop shiny things into these neighborhoods without bringing ourselves to those neighborhoods and empowering the people who are experts in those neighborhoods and following their lead.
That's right. And what I love about, you can see one of the cars out there and you can sign up and get a membership. And what I love about it is this idea of equity used to be that once you made it, you bought a car, and that's how you got to your job. And Salita also talks about this great I don't know, it's a study that you did, or it's just about the access to jobs? Can you repeat it?
Oh,
so
it was
I say it
actually
right?
work by a student at USC, Rachel Junkin. I think she might work in Long Beach now, and I don't know if we've ever actually met, but I tout her work constantly because there's this amazing review she did. It was before the expo line opened up, so I think it probably will change this number, but in LA, you can reach 12 times as many jobs in an hour by car as you can in an hour by transit, which means that you must own a car in order to access economic mobility. And that is even more true when you look at women and families and low-income workers that have jobs that are not in the central core or work second shift and third shift, where we have not been able to fund transit adequately to address those trips. And so when wages rise even a little bit, people flee transit for cheap cars. Or they get displaced, to Phil's point. They get displaced to neighborhoods that transit is very challenged to serve. And so, there's that kind of a challenge with the way that we deliver public transit.
Yeah. So heading off that car purchase or saying, hey, you could borrow this EV, or we are going to change the bus service so it gets closer to your house. And we will also help mitigate the fact that you live by a freeway that gives you access to these things, but it's also destroying your health and your children's health, which is my biggest concern, seeing how we can remake these large pieces of infrastructure and start thinking about it now, how to reclaim them. Maybe that's going to be your first big effort.
It's going to have to be a range of strategies, right? And there was a notion, I think, in post-war Los Angeles that the freeway really represented the city. It represented Angelino's David Broadsley in this great book, Los Angeles Freeway from 1981, called the freeway the synecdoche, the chief metaphor of Los Angeles, right? And I think, as Salita pointed out, more recent scholarship by Eric Avila and others, and just the reality of looking at neighborhoods like Boyle Heights that were really choked off by freeways, has suggested that the reality was always very different for many communities, particularly communities of color, around the region. And I think there has been that notion, though, that just like the single-family house on the lawn sort of defines an Angelino in a very stereotypical sense, that the freeway and car mobility and that kind of independence that we've been talking about sort of has defined the city. But that was always a false narrative, and the truth is we're going to need, a whole sort of roster of choices, some of which will come from the private sector. And I think, to Salita's point, the role of the public in those partnerships is really to insist on equity, to insist that if a private company wants to come in and partner with us, they might not have that interest. They want to, of course, they're looking at the parts of the city that will be most profitable, most successful for them. We have to insist on a different kind of strategy, and I think that's increasingly the role of the public side in those P3s.
And we're seeing that even with the micro-mobility deployment, requiring certain neighborhoods, requiring the scooter and bike companies to look at certain neighborhoods and serve those to help fill in those gaps, which is really great. How are we doing on time? I'm completely oblivious. She's like, no, oh my God, no. All right. Thank you so much. Please thank our amazing speakers who are doing the best work in this city. And it's just such an honor to be here. This is a great conference, and I'm so happy you have chosen LA to land in because we sure do like having you here. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, Alyssa.